Hi, and welcome to Series 3 of the Pen to Publish podcasts with your hosts, Alexa Whitten, author, typesetter, and independent publisher, and
Alexa Tewkesbury, author, editor, and proofreader.
Hi, and welcome to Series 3, all about typesetting.
Series 3. It's so nice to see you again.
So nice to see you too. It's been a while.
Series...
Well, actually, it hasn't been a while. It feels like it was yesterday.
Because Series 2 is currently going out, but obviously we haven't been recording for 2 or 3 months now. So we've had a bit of a summer break.
Yes, which has been lovely, and things have been opening up, so it's been really nice. So this series is all about typesetting, as I said. So you're going to be hearing more from me this series. It was all about Alexa one last series about editing. And in this episode 1, we're going to be talking about typesetting and why it's important. Now, before I begin, I'm just going to explain a little bit about what typesetting is. Typesetting can be referred to as laying out a book, book layout, book design. It comes in sort of different ways of saying what typesetting is, but typesetting is basically arranging your words on a page so it looks nice. Now, as I said, in the last 2 series, we've looked at writing a book, the basics, how to get started, and series 2, which was all about the editing side of things. This was Alexa 1's area of expertise. And for those of you who haven't listened to that yet, go and take a listen. And for those of you that have, what did you think? Did you find it useful? We'd love to know. So please do go and comment on the podcast, give us reviews. It would be great to hear. What did you think was the most important tip from that series, Alexa 1?
The most important tip, I think that would have to be, don't skip the editing process. However well you think your book reads, however sure you are that you find out all the glitches, find an editor and get yourself on their schedule. You won't regret it, and you'll end up with a far more polished book than if you rely totally on your own self-editing or on a family member who isn't qualified but just loves to read. Now, no offense intended to your family members, who I'm sure are lovely, but you know what I mean. Don't skip the professional edit.
Yes, I definitely agree. Definitely agree. Okay, so we're going to start with what typesetting is. And I've already said at the beginning the definitions of typesetting. So we're going to be looking at why it's important, which obviously we're going to be covering in this episode, why fonts, or rather typefaces, matter. There's a lot to formatting books, which is, as I said, a posh word for laying it out. And it's the bit that I love most in my job. So what is typesetting? Well, it's a term used for making the words look pretty on the page. Typesetters used to use wooden blocks, 1 block for each character of the alphabet, including punctuation marks and spaces. And they would literally set them out onto wooden frames ready for the printing press. Things have changed, and we can do this on a computer using special programs like Quark, InDesign, and there are some others that I'm going to be covering in this episode. This isn't something that you need to worry about as an author, but it's a good idea to know what program your book is typeset in, because then if you need to either get someone else to work on it, you then have that information to hand. Now, a lot of people, and by that I mean writers, think that Word, as in Microsoft Word, is enough, but unfortunately it isn't. Word is not designed for laying out books unless you really know what you're doing. And actually, I've had one person set their book out in Microsoft Word, but he was a, he was a maestro at Word and really knew how to use the paragraph styles within the program. And most people don't know how to do that. So I would always get a professional to lay out your book. I've seen many books laid out in Word and it looks awful. You can spot a book that's been laid out in Word a mile off. It's hard to read and just doesn't lend itself well to being read, but more about this later. So why do you need to know about this stuff? Well, if your book is hard to read, then you're not going to have as many people enjoying it. And understanding the basics will help you not only pick the right typesetter, but you'll also be able to make informed decisions too. The most important part of this exercise is to understand that whatever typeface you choose, and by that I mean the more common word, which is font, but that's actually incorrect. Typeface is the name of the group of letters. So for instance, Arial, Times New Roman, Garamond. I'll be explaining more about this later. That is actually what is known by typeface. So it's really important that whatever typeface you choose is relevant to the book that you're writing, because then it will make your book easier to read. And you want it to be easy, right?
Yes, you definitely want it to be easy. As the long-suffering, hardworking writer of a book, you don't want anything to trip your reader up. You want them to have the best experience possible with your writing. So just as editors need your book in a clear, easy to read font, so do readers. And as Alexa just says, you need the typeface to match up with the book content.
Exactly. Now, this all comes back to knowing who your target reader is. And this is why it's so important to know this information. And we talked about knowing the target reader back in series 1, and we did in series 2. So it's a common theme that you need to know this stuff before you start. When you understand the reader, as in, is it male? Is it female? Is it a child? Is it a child with reading difficulties? All of these bits of information will then make it easier to pick the right typeface. In the next 2 episodes, I'll be talking in more detail about the specifics of typefaces, because it's a big subject, and what that means and why it's important. But for now, understanding your target reader, and you should know this already, as I've said, will help you make the most important decisions about this. For instance, if you're writing a self-help book for women, then you might want to consider a more informal layout style for your book, with pretty page headings and an airy feel. Whereas if your target audience is for men, then you'll probably want more of a solid and contrasty feel. Ultimately, doing your research into books that you like to read will help make this decision. Just like we said in the previous episodes, prolific reading will help you understand the book structure. And when it comes to laying out your book, if you know the style you like, the more useful info that is to give to your typesetter. I always ask people when they're coming to me for typesetting tips, what books do they like to read? When they give me that information, it then really helps me. Having your book designed in a way that fits your subject is also key. Now, most novels or fiction books follow a fairly basic formula, and I wouldn't try and mess with this too much. I mean, why fix something that isn't broken? There are some very important rules with this, which I'll be talking about with next week, but I would suggest if your book is a fiction style novel, then plain layout is all that's needed. And by that, I mean simple chapter pages with a number or name, although most adult fiction don't use name for their chapter titles. That's interesting. So bear that in mind. It's usually just a number. Fully justified text. And what I mean by that is the right edge is a straight line and not a jagged one. A jagged line is called unjustified. Simple centered page numbers at the bottom and chapter headers at the top. These are usually centered too. Now, business books are a totally different kettle of fish. They can be in all different types of formatting styles. For instance, page numbers can be at the top of the page, left aligned and right aligned headers, and obviously the book is broken up with lovely subheadings. But more about that in another episode. I'll also pop a sample of traditional novel style layout in the show notes and label them so you can see what I mean by these terms if you're not familiar with them. There's a lot of information that I've just shared to you there, so it might take a few listens for you to understand what I'm talking about. But don't worry, we are going to be talking about all of these things in a later episode in more detail. So I'm just kind of giving you the basics here. So, right, why not to use Word, PowerPoint, or Photoshop to lay out your book? Now, I've already mentioned Microsoft Word, and we talked about that in your submission needs to be in terms of giving it to your editor, because your editor's going to need it in Word, and then I'm going to need it in Word, but I'm not going to format it in Word. It's a little bit complicated, but Alexa, do you want to give us a quick reminder of how editors like the first submission from the author that comes to you?
Yes, if you want more details of that, we talked about it in the first episode of series 2. But briefly, here's what to do with your document if you want your editor to love you, which I'm sure you do. So use a clear font. Times New Roman is great. I also really like Calibri. And don't bother with fancy layouts. Now, that's the typesetter's job. That's what Alexa 2 is talking all about. It's the typesetter's job to lay the book out to look like a book. And a fancy layout from an editor's point of view simply makes their life more difficult. Set your line spacing to 1.5 or 2, as this makes the text even easier to read on screen. And don't justify the text. Now, Alexa 2 just mentioned that in a fiction layout, you will have the text justified. So the same margins either side, the text is straight either side vertically. Don't do that on your Word document, because again, that can mess with the spacing and make it harder for your editor. So for your editor, leave the text unjustified with the raggedy edge on the right-hand side. And inserting a page break at the end of each chapter or section is also really helpful. All those things will help your editor focus on the job of editing rather than tidying up in the first instance.
So just to reiterate, when you're sending your book to the editor, Microsoft Word is the way to go.
Yes.
When the editor then gives it back to me, again, it's in Word. I then take that Word document and then I do all the fancy stuff that I'm talking about. So you don't need to worry about any of that. I'm giving you a background of what your book needs to look like or think about so that you know to tell me that information. I'm not expecting you, once you have the book back from the editor, to then go and try and justify the text and all the rest of it. Don't do that. That's my job. I'm just giving you an overview of what the typesetter is going to be doing. So once your book is back from the editor, this is where it needs to be typeset. That is converting it from Word into a proper looking book. Now, Word, as amazing as it is as a writing tool, isn't the software you should be using to typeset your book, unless you really know what you're doing, which I've explained before, but I wouldn't suggest you try it. I've seen some published books that have been formatted in Word and it looks awful. The lines aren't justified, as I've explained. The headers are a mix of centered and left, right aligned, and the page numbers are the same. They jump from being centered to the left and the right. And as we know, Word is a nightmare when it comes to trying to control where text goes, as it seemed to have a mind of its own. So unless you have a handle on style sheets, and I've actually got a really great article on how to use those, which I'll post in the show notes, I would find a typesetter to format your book for you. After all, you're a writer, you're not a book designer. Other programs that aren't suitable are PowerPoint. Yes, I've had one such submission in PowerPoint. Don't know why. It's not designed for laying out books. It's a presentation program. But I guess the author thought it had more control than Word, which to some extent it does. So they decided to lay their book out in PowerPoint. No.
Not right.
No. Another common program, which is used a lot by illustrators who have been asked to illustrate the book and then typeset it in Photoshop. Now, Photoshop is fantastic for illustration and for editing photos, but it shouldn't be used for typesetting a book. Lots of people do it, and I've had lots of books submitted as a Photoshop file. Now, they're much more easily controlled if the person knows what they're doing, but Photoshop is not a book design layout program. So I would resist getting your illustrator to typeset the book, which is quite common. I would get the illustrator to illustrate and then get a book designer. In fact, I'm working on one now. I've had one such inquiry the other day, a beautifully illustrated book, but the text was all in the wrong place, too near the inside spine, and it was really hard to read. When I explained to the author what was wrong, a light bulb went off and she then understood what had gone wrong. An illustrator isn't a typesetter, as we know. Like Kylie, obviously Dream Team we're talking about here. Kylie's an illustrator. Alexa One's the editor. I'm the typesetter. We all work together and we create fabulous looking books using all of our skills. So what program are best for typesetting? Well, there are quite a few actually. Microsoft has one called Publisher. I've taken a look at it. I don't know how to use it, obviously, because I use InDesign. I have no idea how easy it is. But honestly, if you're a writer, why spend the time learning Publisher when you can get someone to do it for you? There is also one which I know is very popular with writers called Scrivener. I don't know if you heard of that, Alexa one.
I have heard of it, yeah, but I haven't delved into it at all because I do my bit and then I pass it on for the next stage. But I have heard of that one.
So Scrivener has lots of inbuilt templates that you can use. So basically it takes out all the design elements because you choose a template and you just copy in your Word document and it does it for you. Now, you might be thinking, "Ooh, that sounds fantastic." But the key word in there is templates. Now, if it's a novel, I can understand wanting to use a template because, like I've said right at the beginning, novels are usually follow a very standard template. So if it is a novel you're working on, then Scrivener might be the way forward. So go take a look at Scrivener and see whether or not it fits. I know it's a paid for program, so obviously you have to buy it. It's not a free one. And then have a play and see what you think. However, I have had a few books come to me that have been laid out in Scrivener that needed fixing. So do be aware that it, as easy as it might be, like with any new program, it might take you a little while to get to know it. Then there are two designer programs, which I'm going to use in inverted commas because they're the ones that are industry standard. Quark, which is what I learnt on, and InDesign, which is what I now use. InDesign is part of the Adobe suite and it works seamlessly with Photoshop and Illustrator. So why do you need to know this? Well, like I've said before, if you're collaborating with anybody, then understanding the software that is being used, you can then make an informed choice if you decide to then go and use a typesetter. And also, if you then decide to change typesetter, you then know what program your book was designed in if they need to make any changes or adjustments. So I hope you've enjoyed the whistle-stop tour of what typesetting is. It's a very broad subject, which is why we'll be going into the separate components through this series. My advice for newbie authors is to get a typesetter to lay out your book. Yeah, you know, like trying to get your Aunt Maud, who used to be an English teacher, to edit your book. She's probably not quite up to scratch. So like I said, with typesetting a book, you know, get a typesetter. We've talked about the importance of an editor. So if you invested in that, then you don't want your book to then look awful and unreadable. And books that haven't been laid out properly are hard to read. And I've rescued enough of them to know this. And I can also spot one that hasn't been laid out by a professional a mile off. Alexa one, have you got any experience of badly laid out books?
Mostly, actually, I would say I haven't, because I'm fortunate to work with people like you who know what you're doing. But the books that I proofread following design, they've been laid out by professional typesetters who have the right experience and the right programs. There is one children's book that I've seen recently, not one of yours, I hasten to add, that was a bit all over the place. And the author, it's interesting, you mentioned how some people use their illustrators to then lay out their books. Well, this author had used a web designer rather than a specialist book designer, and it really showed. So yes, editing and proofreading are the polish for your words, but you then need a professional book designer if you want your ultimate product to look beautiful. So as Alexa 2 says, it's really not worth skimping on that final stage of the production process, because you're likely to be setting yourself and your readers up for huge disappointment. And also, how nice is it to be able to hand your precious writing over to someone who knows exactly how to make it look its absolute best on the page? I mean, I acknowledge I know nothing about typesetting, and I wouldn't dream of saying, yeah, sure, I'll fling it together in Word for you and that'll be fine, because I know it won't. And I know that I wouldn't have a clue what I'm doing. My favorite tip from the last series, yes, please use a professional editor. Please use a professional typesetter, because I know it's an investment financially, but it's so worth it, and it will also increase your return.
Yes, I think if a book is easy to read and looks beautiful, you're obviously going to get more sales. The best of both worlds is if you use a typesetter who communicates with the editor and illustrator. I mentioned just before the dream team that is you, me, and Kylie. We have this lovely working relationship where we all know each other. We all like each other as well, very much so. And we communicate regularly with the project. So it's a real collaborative effort. We've also started working on projects that include Kylie, who is an illustrator, and we've published 2 of her books. So she now knows so much more about the process going forward. So now when she's illustrating for other people, which is what she's doing, because of the knowledge with her first book and what I've brought to the table in terms of how to lay out the illustrations for the pages for layout, she's now being able to do the same for other people. So it's not just the design aspect, but obviously the editing and the illustrating side of things too. So it's the holistic approach, really. So do your research and don't try and typeset your book in Word is all I can say, because it'll cost you in time. And I would almost 100% guarantee you'll need it to be redone. So the next episode, typefaces or fonts, part 1, serif versus sans serif, and what that means is what we're going to be talking about in the next episode. This is a really important subject, as you'll see, because it really makes your book either readable or not readable. Do tune in.
Yeah, I love learning about this side of book production because, as I've said, it's the next phase on from what I do. It's not something I'm ever involved in beyond proofreading what a typesetter has laid out. And occasionally an author will contact me and ask me a designy question, and I'll say, no, that's your typesetter. Do ask them about that because I know nothing. But how you, as the typesetter, achieve the book design, Alexa, is fascinating to me. So I'm looking forward to hearing more.
Next week, we've broken up the episode on typefaces because it's such a broad subject into 2. And also, if you're part of the Reluctant Writers Facebook group, do come and join us.
Yes, do. There's prizes and everything sometimes. You should really definitely join.
Come and join the Reluctance Facebook group, because I also do workshops on all of this sort of subject. So I'm just currently going to be doing a workshop on typefaces and how to select your font. So come and join the group if you want to. Alexa 1 is in that group. Kylie is in that group. And lots of people that we talk about actually are in that group. So come and join us. It would be lovely to see you. So that's it from us for this week. And we'll be seeing you hopefully this time next week on the Pen to Publish podcast. Bye.
Bye-bye.